not know Spider-Man for swinging around New York, taking on mostly animal and insect-themed supervillains, kicking butt and taking names, while always being the stand-up guy he is, but also just being broke as hell, not all stories can be winners. Sometimes they get bad, or just plain weird. But no matter what, they're always interesting and worth a read. So those stories are what we're exploring today. In Intense Spider-Man Sins Past, Norman Osborn was eventually led to believe that during the period where his brain was wiped out and the Goblin persona brought it back, that he had been involved in a brief affair with Gwen Stacy, while she was still in a relationship with Peter Parker, no doubt, during her time in Europe. He was also led to believe that the affair resulted in the birth of twins, Gabriel and Sarah. This is one of the plot points of Sins Past, where there is a series of very intense panels where Norman and Gwen are getting it on, which is honestly horrific to think about and probably one of the worst things to ever happen to both Peter and Gwen, aside from, Gwen dying and cracking her head on the ground. But say what you want about Spider-Man movies, at least Tobey ended up saving Gwen. However, it was revealed in Amazing Spider-Man number 73 that these were false memories implanted later in his life by Mysterio, who was hired by Harry Osborn at the time in order to torture Peter, Mary Jane, and his own father. The twins, that were in actuality genetically created constructs from Norman and Gwen's DNA, were later taken with Osborn to Europe during his sabbatical. And at 9 Amazing Spider-Man number 386 to 388. The 90s era of comics could really get away with a lot of things, and with the Spider-Man animated series well in the works in the 90s, there was plenty of things to adapt. One of those that wasn't adapted though was Amazing Spider-Man number 386 to 388, and it's a good thing too, because honestly, it's pretty damn weird. In this story, it's revealed that Peter Parker's parents were alive and had faked their deaths as a part of some secret government plan. Yeah, not only were Peter's parents still kicking around, but they're government agents too. An idea that seemingly the Amazing Spider-Man movies were planning to adapt before getting canned, especially if you watch the deleted scene where Peter's father makes a dramatic return while Peter's standing at Gwen's grave. But if that's not bafflingly dumb enough for you, okay, then how about the fact that it's revealed that his seemingly resurrected parents were in fact robots created by the Chameleon for Norman Osborn, so Peter could reveal to him his identity, which is pretty odd, especially given that Green Goblin already knew that Peter Parker and Spider-Man are the same person. Plus, you would have to know who he is to make the robots of his dead parents in the first place so that he could then reveal his identity to you, right? And at 8, Dead No More, The Clone Conspiracy. This storyline details Jackal resurfacing as he manages to get Rhino, Lizard, Dr. Octopus, and a female Electro on his side with the chance of reuniting with their loved ones. Spider-Man is soon sighted by one of Miles Warren's clones, or assistants, or whatever you want to call them, who calls the Rhino and Electro for help. Jackal later sends Rhino to convince Kingpin to join up with him while using a revived Vanessa Fisk as persuasion. Kingpin then snaps this Vanessa Fisk's neck, calling her an abomination and not his real wife. Spider-Man appears at Fisk Industries and Kingpin goes after Rhino. Upon hearing that Kingpin declined the offer, Jackal tells Rhino that he gained 1 strike. Jackal is then seen with a revived Gwen Stacy at his side. After dispatching the 2 villains, Spider-Man continues to pursue Miles, only to find Gwen Stacy behind the closed door. The shock of Gwen's presence prevents Spidey from reacting to his spider sense on time, and then he gets sucker punched by the returned Doc Ock. At the end of this story, some of these villains dissolve while others don't, but after the show that was the first Clone Wars, I don't think that they should have done another, and I think that they should have probably thought of that too. And at 7, Spider-Man Power Pack. Spider-Man is the last person you'd think of when it comes to superheroes who have been assaulted. And there have been some weird PSA comics in general, like when Superman was anti-Japan. But in one of the oddest PSA comics to come out, Power Pack sees that Peter Parker had been assaulted before he became Spider-Man, and not in a physical punching kind of way. After saving a boy named Tony from being assaulted by his babysitter Judy, just after a panel where Judy honestly says, "What happened here tonight is our little secret and you better not tell," creepy as hell, while Tony is actually crying in that same panel, but luckily nothing happened before Spidey showed up. We then get a flashback to Peter's pre-Spider-Man days, where he meets up with a guy named Skip. The two hit it off and become friends, but Skip invites him over to his house, they play some pool, Peter finds some adult magazines, and Skip gets closer to the young would-be hero. We never see what really happens, but it's heavily implied that Skip assaults Peter. Peter then takes Tony to his parents, and Tony explains to them what happened. But yeah, while it does have a great message, like you gotta tell adults about what's going on, it certainly was an odd way to deliver it. And at 6, Amazing Spider-Man number 131. In the 70s, for one reason or another, Aunt May ended up somehow inheriting a nuclear facility in Canada. However, she didn't know, because after getting out of prison, Otto hires Aunt May as a housekeeper, and then comes across a letter she got from a Canadian lawyer saying that she has inherited a nuclear facility in Canada for reasons, also known as plot. So he hides this information from her, kills the Canadian lawyer, I guess by going to Canada, and then pretends to fall in love with Aunt May so that he can get married and have the facility. After he kills her, of course. While May and Otto still have some romantic history, this little ordeal is often not mentioned, and for obvious reasons. However, eventually it does make another appearance in probably one of the most absolutely horrific moments in all of comic book history that I wish I could forget about, but that's later on the list. If I have to suffer this knowledge, so do you. Halfway through into number 5, Spider-Man One More Day. After siding with Tony in the events of the first Civil War, Spider-Man had to reveal his identity to the world in order to continue fighting crime. And, you know, since every supervillain on Earth now knows how to get to Spider-Man, Kingpin ends up attacking Peter at his home. He dodges the bullets, but they end up hitting Aunt May instead, putting her in critical condition. This is the start of the One More Day storyline, probably the most universally hated Spider-Man run of all time. Since in order to save Aunt May, Peter talks to Mephisto and ends up selling his marriage to Mary Jane in order to save his aunt. So their entire marriage will get erased so that he can have one more day with his aunt. Aside from living with the consequences of your own actions, which is already pretty damn horrible, I mean, MJ had to agree to it as well. But seriously, like, if you're realistic, like brutally realistic, how many years does Aunt May really have left? Not many. So selling your marriage to bring your one foot in the grave aunt back doesn't really seem like an even trade to me. Just saying. You heard it right, ladies. I'd let my old aunt die for you. Okay. And at 4, Superior Spider-Man. So you know how I just talked about Doc Ock and Aunt May almost getting married? Yeah. Well, I thought that story had been long forgotten and that it just wasn't a part of the continuity anymore, but unfortunately no. And it made its way back into Amazing Spider-Man number 699, which was basically the start of the Superior Spider-Man arc, where Doc Ock and Peter end up switching bodies, and then Ock goes on to become a much more brutal hero, but eventually a hero nonetheless. Peter does eventually end up getting his body back, but it's certainly an odd but great story that you should read. However, the start of this is what makes it even worse and why I put it on this list. Before Otto's body dies, Peter tries to access his memories, since Ock can access Peter's. But Peter ends up getting more than he bargained for when he unlocks the memories of the night before May and Otto's wedding, where they consummate things even before they were married. So yeah, as if Peter hadn't been through enough already, he had to watch his aunt get it on with one of his worst enemies and remember it forever. In first person mode, nonetheless, because it was Otto's memory. Getting close to the end in number 3, Man Spider. Remember when Sam Raimi's Spider-Man had organic web shooters rather than making them himself like in the comics? Well, while that's totally another can of worms that not only makes going to the doctor difficult, which just doesn't seem to matter come Spider-Man 2, but also just makes me wonder how that would feel coming out of your skin. Still, some fans were disappointed with this change. Marvel would eventually attempt to make this thing actually canon in the main comics, and while it was a noble intention, the way that they actually did it was crazy. After an encounter with a spider villain called the Queen, Spider-Man slowly starts becoming an actual spider like he does in the 90s cartoon, and learns that he's pregnant despite being a male. Eventually, the spider dies but gives birth to Spider-Man. Yeah, with all the memories that he already had. The only difference between him then and now is that he no longer looked like a spider and he had organic web shooters. Thanks, Raimi. Penultimately, in at number 2, Spider-Man Reign. I know I say I hate talking about this, but again, if I have to suffer through this knowledge, so does everyone else. And you know what? Me telling you about this is like my own way of being a supervillain, without killing people. In the Spider-Man Reign storyline, it's revealed that Mary Jane is dead, but later on it's revealed why she's dead. Because, you know, she was married to Peter and wanted to have kids with him, so they tried. But the thing is, a radioactive spider biting your hand does more to a man than just let him stick to walls and let you do sick flips. It also fills that man with radiation. And anything else he fills also gets filled with radiation. You see where I'm going with this. Whether you're role-playing a lab experiment or not, that's what ended up happening after all, since Mary Jane ends up dying of cancer thanks to the radiation that Peter was packing in those swimmers. Yeah, it's absolutely horrible, and while yes, it was a question everyone did have, it's not something we wanted an answer to, especially if this is the way that you went about it. Come on, just tell us it's a bad idea. Give us another universe's Spider-Man that just tells Peter not to do it. That's all you need to know. And finally, in at number 1, The Amazing Spider-Man vs. the Prodigy. I know I said that the Power Pack was probably one of the weirdest PSA comics out there, and It is. However, Amazing Spider-Man vs. the Prodigy is yet another one because what the hell? In 1976, in a plot to gain a large crop of new child laborers for his home planet, the Prodigy, an alien in human disguise, attempts to convince teenagers to have unprotected coitus. Using his power of vocal persuasion, which will convince teenagers to listen to his every command, the Prodigy denounces information about the risks and consequences of teen pregnancy and venereal disease. Spider-Man steps in before the Prodigy's teenage victims can fall for his ploy and stops the Prodigy from speaking at all by shooting web down his throat, which I mean seems like a whole other PSA about how you should shoot webbing down your throat instead of having kids, if you know what I'm saying. But this is certainly the weirdest Spider-Man story out there that you absolutely need to read. This one-shot PSA was jointly released by Marvel Comics and Planned Parenthood, and maybe my parents should have read that. That's all the time we have for today, friends. Thank you all so much for watching. I have been in Showerman Connor Monroe, and I'll see you in another video unless they fire me for this.